Hey guys, Ellie Weekly here, and today we're going to talk about The Magicians. Now there are a lot of good shows, and there's a selected few great time-defining shows. And really there's an infinite amount of bad shows. But there's really only one show that truly combines it all, and that show is The Magicians. Get ready for weird, hilarious, oftentimes cringy, ultra meta moments, and spoilers. Yeah, I'll try to be gentle. This is a show that is hard to get into. I've tried to push it onto my friends on multiple occasions, and in most cases it didn't work. But because of this slow start, this show is tragically underrated. That show has it all. It has magic, it has secret worlds, it has gore, it has queer representations, mental health issues, and drama that is reminiscent of a high school TV show and multiplied by like 1,000. But really, I can name a lot of things. Doesn't matter to you right now, but it will in a bit. But the reason The Magicians aren't like any other show is the subversion of fantasy in a very particular way. So let's talk about that. What is fantasy? Fantasy, as we know it, is a genre that developed largely from the greatest fantasy writer, Tolkien. The elves, the dwarves, the battle with the ultimate evil, you know the tropes. And they existed before, it's just that Tolkien made it increasingly popular. However, the idea of what fantasy is still changed over time in a very significant way. When we talk about fantasy now, we can't ignore such books as The Song of Ice and Fire or The Witcher, and a lot more. The expectation of this noble, uncorrupted hero is vanishing, and so is the idea of this unyielding villain that is evil for evil's sake. Thankfully, we now try to see what those characters are and look at their backstories more. Try to understand them. And this gave way to the second generation of fantasy, the subversion of the established genre. The characters became more complex, less black and white, and more gray area characters. The conflicts became increasingly more human and interrelational rather than the good against the bad. And we learned through these fantasy books that there is no good or bad, there are just choices, and the consequences of these choices. And whether you see them as good or bad are up to your morality standards. And The Magicians are a step into the third generation. I'm not sure whether this is an actual generation forming, or it's just a blip ahead of its time, since we're still exploring the likable villains and the anti-heroes. But it's an interesting phenomenon nonetheless. Think back on the fantasy that you know. The most common tropes are the hero, the guide, the magical creatures, although there's a lot of variation on that one, since a lot of creatures are different, but most of them intersect in some way. A very close trope to the latter is the different species trope. The elves, the dwarves, fairies, fauns, beavers, what have you. Another crucial aspect of fantasy is the quest that the heroes are put on. Usually it's something huge, something only our protagonists can do, otherwise everyone is doomed. So it's kind of hard to walk away from it. It's mostly fight against ultimate evil, so usually an ultra evil witch or lord or lordess are present. Magic is pretty much a given in any fantasy. And lastly, a very common trait is the relatively ancient/medieval nature of the secret world that our characters escape to. Well, as seen in the second generation of fantasy, the first part of the tropes mentioned are becoming increasingly more challenged. Less creatures, more people, less heroes or wise guides, and more morally gray characters. But the ancient world, the magic, the quest-like plotline remains. Otherwise, it's rarely framed as fantasy. Much like the Community challenges the idea of sitcom, Rick and Morty challenged the idea of pretty much all of TV, The Magicians challenge the idea of fantasy. They're incredibly self-aware and make fun of each and every trope of fantasy. The hero is not a hero, the guide that we're introduced to is not a guide but rather a self-centered alcoholic that is not actually helpful in any way.
Eliza is dead. When the beast comes back, what do we... She's the only one who could actually give me answers.
There are no answers, Quentin. Because we have no idea what's going to happen next. Most likely outcome. Especially now that he's gotten Eliza out of the way. You die. Your friends die. We all die. Very bloody.
The amount of creatures, gods, demigods, ghosts, niffins, and other magical nonsense is through the roof, and we watch the characters find out about them with just as much skepticism and sarcasm as they ask.
Do I know about the fairies?
On top of that, the quest storyline is rather literal.
I'll do you better. There's a problem far greater than fairies. Solve it, they're nothing. I'll send you on an epic quest.
That's... wow. That's great.
Every time we're introduced to the evil they're fighting this time, we know that there is a bigger fish in the pool, or rather, next season. And by the end of 5th season, they take it pretty far, believe me. The secret world that the characters enter by the end of season 1 is literally through the wardrobe. Oh, what? That's already taken? Oh, well then they enter through the clock. Narnia Schmarnia. No one's gonna see that coming. No, but this is actually intentional. Just take a look at Lev Grossman, the author of the books, talking about it.
Place in a magical land called Fillory, which, for legal purposes, bears no resemblance whatsoever to Narnia.
So the secret medieval world trope. We start off in the real contemporary world, but then the story diverts into 3 different ones. The one in reality, the one in Breakville School of Magic, and the one in Fillory. And Fillory is medievalistic. But here's a twist. They actually create a lot of jokes for the characters because they find out that things have not been developed or created yet. And for some reason that never came up in Narnia, but clearly the absence of flushing toilets for the characters who used to live in the 20th century would be a bit of an issue, right? Well, it is in The Magicians. And champagne is probably the biggest loss for Elliot.
And do you know they don't know what champagne is here? I plan on inventing it. I like to be known as a champagne king.
Escapism. Did you ever feel like Harry Potter is living in a bubble? Like, have you ever thought, how strange that these geeky wizards never talk about any kind of fiction books that we know? Well, Lev Grossman did, and he broke that bubble. Their main characters are talking about pop culture almost constantly. They're aware of it, they make fun of themselves for being in a situation like pop culture fantasy.
You watched Battlestar, right?
Yeah, I love when they do terrorism allegory with mostly white people.
You remember Grace Park in season 1?
Of course, best storyline.
Why?
Duh, because she was actually...
You're Grace Park, okay? You're Grace Park, Margot.
I'm Grace Park.
Yeah. And we have ourselves a bit of a Gene Hackman in the conversation.
I didn't see that one.
Right. Someone is XOXO gossip girling our shit. Remember James Marsden in X-Men? Your Marsden is XOXOing us full on that great song by the Police.
That Farouja Balk in the crowd.
Yeah, more Cersei Lannister.
Hey, glad I made you read those.
Well, I read the wiki. What? Those books are like 1,000,000 pages long. I have a life.
Okay.
And they talk about culture that is not theirs, like Game of Thrones or Handmaid's Tale.
Look who's up. Trump and Aunt Lydia. Welcome to the New Desert Order.
And yes, she did just say Trump. They don't live in a vacuum of simple reality that they escape to a more interesting one. The doings of us muggles are affecting the magical world too. Isn't that fun? This is such a drastic change to Harry Potter, and that's just brilliant. Another thing about the genre of fantasy is the issue of escapism. Time and time again, fantasy has been named as the genre that pulls us out of reality and into a magical world, much like the wardrobe in Narnia. Time moves differently in the magical land and the reality land. Or like Harry Potter, the world is hiding in plain sight with a work of magic. They live in a magical world where problems of us, readers, don't really exist. They're replaced with magical problems. They're perceived as larger than life, mostly as the depiction of the ultimate evil, like the White Witch, or the Voldemort, or Sauron. And the second generation of fantasy doesn't break that wall between reality and magical world either. We, as the onlooker, are still detached from reality, but the problematics of the real world are more obvious, not just hidden in symbolic cues anymore. The Lord of the Flies is a more obvious allegorical narrative that arguably could also be considered as fantasy, but that's another topic for an essay. Regardless, even though we recognize our issues, it still doesn't negate the fact that the characters are not seemingly aware of them. And that's fine, because it's expected of fantasy. But we've been bending the rules of art for so long that it's about time that we did something different and finally broke the rule of this escapist fantasy literature. And that's exactly what happened, thanks to Lev Grossman. This is also very likely to have been inspired by the postmodernist state of culture and art, or at the very least unconsciously inspired. So what is postmodernism? In short, a long time ago, humans created craft and art and started making beautiful, inspiring things. And then came the 20th century, and people started breaking the tradition and developing new ways to create beautiful, inspiring things. And then came the 60s, and people went, there's really not that much to do anymore. How about I just make a collage of things and that will be art? And that's what they did. And that's essentially what postmodernism is. And honestly, I think that's one of the coolest things that anyone ever thought of. We've created parody and pastiche and paying an homage to certain inspirational creations of the past. And we see that happening for quite some time in art, but it's a relatively recent occurrence in television. Come to think of it, it's really quite inescapable that fantasy had to go the same way, because it's a natural way that art develops. The genre appeared, started deconstructing itself, and then it started making a collage of itself, further deconstructing itself. And the magicians do that with beautiful special effects, awesome characters, and brilliant sense of humor. They're aware of the issues of the world, they're aware that fantasy and young adult fiction is sometimes campy and hard to swallow, so they multiply that cringe by a factor of 1,000. They're aware that this is a TV show. For example, in the books, Margot is called Janet. This is just a cosmetic choice that doesn't influence the story that much, but here, in this tiny little moment, they show that they're aware of it.
Penny, Alice, Elliot, and Janet, you are all late.
Actually, it's Margot.
This time.
Or for example, this.
Still good.
Last looks.
Eating out with Josh Hoberman, scene 1, take 1, marker.
I'm eating what? But no one in Fillory has a TV, so why am I questioning this? Action! Any baker worth their gluten knows a biscuit is only as good as its flour. Add a drizzle of lavender-infused honey, and trust me, you'd eat this right off the floor.
Or that.
Our squad is a joke. What plan? Exactly.
We'll figure it out. We always do.
When it's a final to cheat on, not when we're stuck in some epic fantasy that likes to behead its heroes halfway through season 1. If we even are heroes, we might be comic relief.
And yes, once in a while they will break out in song out of absolutely nowhere. Because it's funny. And why not?
Remember all the lyrics. It's practically the entire cast.
Which is why... magic.
No, I should practice.
So move your ass and sing. Beyonce does, which is why she's a boss.
Don't make me sing.
One day more. Another day, another destiny. This never-ending road to Calvary. These men who seem to know my crime will surely come a second time one day more.
I did not live until today. How can I live when we are parted?
One day more.
Tomorrow you'll be worlds away. And yet with you my world has started. This all evolves from a rather tame and boorish young adult season 1 to a masterpiece of season 3 and 4. And if someone disagrees with me, I'll fight with you in the comments. So my advice is, get through the first season and enjoy the postmodern subversion of fantasy. Beautiful representation of feminism, queerness, mental health issues, and a lot of other things. Anywho, thanks for watching LA Weekly that is not actually weekly, and don't forget to subscribe to my Instagram. Bye bye!